Hi, it is both a privilege and an intellectual challenge to speak to you today on a topic that sits at the crossroads of philosophy, geography, economics, and cultural theory, postmodern approaches in regional development. This is not merely an academic discussion, it is a reflection on how we understand the world, how we construct knowledge, and ultimately how we shape the future of regions and societies. Let me begin with a simple but unsettling proposition. What if everything we have assumed about development, progress, growth, modernization is not universal truth, but rather a culturally specific narrative? This question lies at the heart of postmodern thinking. Postmodernism, as many of you will know, is most famously articulated in the work of the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, particularly in his seminal 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. In this text, Lyotard famously declared an incredulity toward meta-narratives, that is, a deep skepticism toward grand universal theories that claim to explain everything. So, postmodernism does not offer a single unified theory. Rather, it attempts to equalize diverse schools of thought, to embrace plurality, and to challenge the authority of dominant paradigms. It resists the idea that there is one correct path to knowledge, development, or truth. Postmodern thinking raises several profound and sometimes uncomfortable issues. First, it rejects modernism and rationalism, along with the idea that science can produce objective, universal truths. The Enlightenment belief in reason as the ultimate guide is called into question. Instead, knowledge is seen as fragmented, contextual, and shaped by power relations. Second, postmodernism highlights the rise of mercantilism and consumerism, where everything, including knowledge itself, becomes a commodity. The boundaries between original and copy, authentic and artificial, art and kitsch begin to dissolve. In such a world, the question is no longer is it true, but rather can it be sold? Third, there is an increasing awareness of the limits of knowledge. Every new conceptual framework creates new boundaries, new blind spots. Knowledge is no longer seen as neutral, it is shaped by context, by culture, by ideology. As Lyotard argued, objective knowledge is ultimately unattainable. Fourth, postmodernism grapples with pluralism not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality. We see attempts to respond to this plurality through hermeneutics, liberal political frameworks, religious dogmas, and even new forms of ideological rigidity, such as ecofascism or certain strands of New Age thinking. Finally, postmodern thought seeks to reformulate relationships between old and new paradigms, between classical science and emerging alternative approaches. This includes debates in ontology and epistemology, as well as the rise of movements such as holism, ecofeminism, and various forms of cultural revivalism. So now, why does this matter for regional development? Because for much of the 20th century, development theory was dominated by modernist paradigms, whether capitalist, Marxist, or structuralist. These frameworks assumed that all societies would or should follow a similar path of development, often modeled after Western Europe or North America. But from the late 20th century onwards, postmodern theories began to challenge this assumption. They questioned not only the effectiveness of these models, but also their legitimacy. They also asked who defines development, for whom, and at what cost. Let us now turn to post-structuralism, a crucial strand within postmodern thought. The key figures here are Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. While structuralism sought to uncover universal structures underlying human culture, post-structuralism dismantles this ambition. It reintroduces philosophy, history, and contingency into the equation. Post-structuralism fundamentally rejects the idea of absolute universal truth. Such claims, it argues, are not only impossible but potentially dangerous because they often serve political agendas. Derrida famously critiqued Western rationality as a form of intellectual imperialism, and namely intellectual imperialism, suggesting that what is presented as universal reason is often merely a culturally specific worldview imposed on others. Foucault, on the other hand, focused on the intricate relationship between power, knowledge, and truth. He asked three critical questions. How do we relate to games of truth within our culture? How do power relations shape our interactions with others? And how are truth, power, and the self interconnected? For Foucault, power is not centralized. It is not simply imposed from the top down. Rather, it exists in networks, in institutions, in everyday practices, even in subconscious desires. So it operates through minors, local and regional institutions, social norms and internalized behaviors, minors, relational networks, and the accumulation of authorized knowledge. Truth, therefore, is not external to power. Each society constructs its own regime of truth. This has profound implications for regional development. Traditional development theories often assume a linear progression of stages from pre-industrial to post-industrial societies. But post-structuralists argue that this model is deeply rooted in Western historical experience and cannot be universally applied. Let's consider the case of Rwanda. Following the 1994 genocide, Rwanda's development strategy did not simply replicate Western models. Instead, it incorporated local governance practices such as Gacaca courts, blending traditional justice mechanisms with modern state structures. From a post-structuralist perspective, this reflects a localized truth regime, a development pathway shaped by specific historical, cultural, and political conditions rather than a universal blueprint. Foucault would likely argue that Rwanda's development is not merely an economic process but a reconfiguration of power relations, knowledge systems, and social norms. If post-structuralism questions how knowledge and power shape development, post-development theory goes even further. It questions whether development itself is a meaningful or desirable goal. The leading figures here include Arturo Escobar and Majid Ranema, and their critique is radical. They argue that decades of development efforts, whether capitalist, socialist, or structuralist, have largely failed in the global south. Instead of prosperity, many countries have experienced poverty, debt, inequality, and environmental degradation. Thus, post-development theory proposes several alternatives. First, the concept of radical plurality. Instead of large-scale, centralized development programs, we should support small, local initiatives rooted in community values. These initiatives prioritize collective well-being over individual accumulation. Second, the idea of a simple lifestyle. This challenges the consumerist model of development, emphasizing sustainability, spirituality, and equitable resource distribution. It calls for a reduction in the excessive consumption of industrialized nations. Third, the re-evaluation of pre-capitalist societies. Contrary to common assumptions, these societies were not necessarily impoverished or backward. They often had rich social structures, sustainable practices, and meaningful cultural lives. Post-development theorists go so far as to suggest that the concept of development itself is a myth, a narrative that gained power by aligning the interests of post-colonial elites and populations seeking liberation from poverty. Let us consider example from Ghana. In recent years, Ghana has seen a resurgence of local agricultural movements emphasizing indigenous farming techniques, community-based markets, and food sovereignty. These initiatives often operate outside large-scale industrial frameworks and prioritize sustainability over export-driven growth. From a post-development perspective, such initiatives represent a rejection of Western development models and a return to locally grounded practices. They illustrate the possibility of alternative pathways, ones that do not rely on constant economic expansion or global integration. However, and this is crucial, critics argue that post-development theory can be overly romantic. It risks idealizing poverty or underestimating the benefits of modern infrastructure, healthcare, and education. No discussion of regional development would be complete without addressing the role of gender. Postmodern feminism introduces a critical lens through which we examine power, identity, and inequality in development processes. Traditionally, feminism is divided into two main strands. First is liberal feminism. Liberal feminism focuses on equal rights and opportunities. It seeks legal reforms, political representation, and access to education and employment. It operates within the existing system, aiming to improve it through gradual change. Another standard is radical feminism. Radical feminism, by contrast, challenges the very foundations of patriarchal society. It argues that gender differences are fundamental and that existing systems are inherently oppressive. Some radical feminists even envision entirely new social structures, reimagining biological and social roles. From a regional development perspective, the key issue is participation. Women's involvement in economic and political life is essential for sustainable development. Let's consider an example from the Czech Republic. The country is known for its generous parental leave policies, allowing up to 4 years of leave. While this supports family life, it also creates challenges. Many women experience reduced employability due to prolonged absence from the workforce. This illustrates a key tension in postmodern feminist thought. Policies designed to promote equality can sometimes reinforce structural inequalities. Current debates in the Czech Republic focus on solutions such as minus flexible working arrangements, minus part-time employment, shared parental responsibilities, and expanded childcare infrastructure. From a postmodern perspective, there is no single correct policy. Instead, solutions must be context-specific, reflecting cultural norms, economic conditions, and individual preferences. Let me conclude by returning to the central tension within postmodern approaches to regional development. On the one hand, these theories provide a powerful critique of traditional development models. They expose the limitations of universal theories, the biases of Western paradigms, and the unintended consequences of large-scale interventions. On the other hand, they often struggle to provide practical alternatives. It is relatively easy to reject consumerism, globalization, or Western development models. History has shown us that such rejections are possible even on a large scale, but creating viable, sustainable alternatives is far more challenging. The concept of radical plurality, for instance, raises important ethical questions. While it promotes diversity and local autonomy, it may also risk fragmentation or even new forms of exclusion. However, the emphasis on collective rights over individual freedoms can, in extreme cases, lead to authoritarian tendencies and dictatorship. Despite these challenges, postmodern approaches offer something invaluable: humility. They remind us that development is not a universal formula. It is a complex, contested, and deeply human process. They encourage us to listen to local voices, to marginalized communities, to alternative perspectives. They invite us to question not only how we develop, but why. And perhaps most importantly, they challenge us to imagine a world where multiple paths to development coexist, where diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be embraced. Thank you for your attention.